It was one of those still, almost sacred nights you only find in quiet suburban lanes. The kind of evening when the wind whispers through the treetops and the street lamps cast long, honey-toned shadows over the freshly paved asphalt. There were no sounds of traffic, no rattling trash cans, just the soft rustle of leaves and the faint hum of distant insects. Then, almost without warning, a sleek black SUV glided into view, its polished silhouette glinting beneath the diffused glow of the overhead lights. Inside that darkened cabin sat a figure, whose presence seemed to echo through the silence, a man whose very posture spoke of decades spent in disciplined service. No uniform, no medals on display, just a plain charcoal shirt and slacks. Yet anyone who happened to glimpse him through the tinted glass would sense an authority born of countless command briefings and long nights in the Pentagon's war rooms. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The SUV rolled steadily forward, passing beneath the oaks that lined the sidewalk, their branches swaying like silent witnesses. Then, behind it, a single patrol car emerged, its engine's soft growl at odds with the hush of the neighborhood. Without a word or a siren, the cruiser eased into pursuit. Its red and blue lights beginning to pulse in muted flashes, an understated, almost apologetic signal that a traffic stop was about to unfold. On a night that offered nothing more than a peaceful drive home, the sudden appearance of those warning lights felt like a crack in reality. The quiet avenue, once so private and untroubled, now awaited the unfolding of an entirely different story, one in which power, protocol, and plain-spoken courage would collide under the watchful glow of those street lamps. He sat behind the wheel like a man still in uniform, even though he wore nothing more than a simple charcoal shirt and dark slacks. His shoulders remained squared, his back rigid. After 32 years in the Army, from the mud-stained fields of basic training to the hushed, high-stakes strategy rooms of the Pentagon, he carried an air of unshakable discipline. Every medal, every commendation pinned to his record, had been earned through long days, longer nights, and countless decisions made under pressure. Tonight, however, the general simply wanted to go home. He had spent the better part of the afternoon chairing classified briefings, weighing options that affected the lives of thousands, and crafting directives that would ripple through the chain of command. His thoughts were on dinner, on the quiet comfort of his study, perhaps even on a chance to catch a few pages of the novel waiting on his nightstand. He felt, in that moment, both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, in that he was just another driver winding through a residential street. Extraordinary, in that every fiber of his being had been honed to meet danger head-on. His weary eyes flicked to the rearview mirror as the patrol car slid into place behind him. He noted the lack of siren, a quiet kind of alert that spoke volumes in the young officer's silhouette against the flashing red-blue glow. A twinge of annoyance flickered in his mind. He hadn't violated any law. He wasn't even certain what had drawn the officer's suspicion. He allowed himself a patient breath, an old habit from years of teaching recruits to remain calm in the face of chaos. When he opened his mouth to greet the officer, his voice was measured, courteous. "Good evening, officer. May I ask what the stop is for?" In that single question lay the years of leadership. He had amassed a calm front, an expectation of respect. Yet he could not have guessed that this routine exchange would become the crucible in which his own dignity and the very meaning of authority would be tested. The patrol car's engine hummed as the young officer slid from the driver's seat. He was still in the early months of his career, fresh-faced, jaw set with determination, yet without the comfort of seasoned judgment. He leaned forward, peering at the SUV's license plate through the open window. His hand brushed over the grip of his service pistol, a gesture more about asserting confidence than necessity. Under the swaying canopy of oak limbs, the SUV's turn signal blinked in quiet objection. The general sat motionless behind the wheel, watching every move with measured composure. The young officer rapped on the tinted glass with more force than etiquette required, an audible announcement of his authority. In his mind rang the mantra he'd been taught at the academy: protect, enforce, prove yourself. This car didn't belong here. Still, his training had not prepared him for the unexpected. The dignified posture of a man whose presence spoke volumes. He cleared his throat and widened his stance. "License and registration," he barked, attempting to project a firmness he hoped masked any lingering uncertainty. The general complied, passing over credentials that gleamed with years of service. Yet the officer's eyes flicked not to the details but to the medals embossed on the ID, trophies of valor he barely understood. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Shouldn't this suffice? Yet something in his gut urged him onward, a craving to demonstrate he could handle anything, even a high-ranking stranger in a luxury vehicle. He swallowed, suppressing the tension twisting his shoulders. In that moment, the unsteady balance between youthful ambition and seasoned authority teetered dangerously. He handed the paperwork back without a word of apology or explanation. The general's eyes held neither anger nor fear, only the quiet assurance of a lifetime spent upholding order. The young officer stepped back, heart pounding, realizing that the simple act of exerting control had become far more complex than any traffic stop he'd rehearsed. The night air, once calm, now crackled with unspoken questions. Who truly held the authority to judge? And at what cost of both badge and honor? License and registration, the young officer repeated, his tone clipped and unyielding. He ignored the general's courteous question, his eyes fixed on the credentials, as though they were foreign artifacts. With calm precision, the general handed over his ID and vehicle papers, the faint reflection of his service ribbons catching the street lamp's glow. "Good evening, officer," he said, voice measured and respectful. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" The officer offered nothing but a dismissive shrug, as if politeness were a complication he hadn't trained for. He flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing over the photograph. At that moment, his face lost whatever courtesy he'd mustered. "Where'd you steal this car from?" he scoffed, the words tumbling out with a mocking laugh. It was a jab meant to unnerve. Years of military decorum couldn't erase the flicker of incredulity in the officer's eyes. He saw a man in civilian clothes, no uniform, no flashing insignia, and assumed the worst. In his mind, the gleaming sub was a trophy unearned, its driver a convenient suspect. Yet the general's stature never wavered. He met that dubious gaze without resentment, his posture reminding the young cop of a lifetime of earned rank. "Sir," the officer continued, voice rising as he leaned closer, "this type of vehicle doesn't belong to someone like you." He tapped the edge of the registration like a judge's gavel. The words dripped with suspicion, a clear show of bias that no saluting or medals could override. The general inhaled slowly, summoning patience worn smooth by decades of discipline. "I assure you, officer," he replied evenly, "this vehicle is registered to me. You may confirm with dispatch." His calm was not weakness. It was the steady core of authority tested in far graver circumstances. For a heartbeat, the officer's resolve faltered. He glanced back at his cruiser's flashing lights, then at the general's unflinching eyes. The night air hung heavy with expectation. Would he relent? Or would he force escalation? Silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the soft rustle of leaves. In that moment, respect and suspicion clashed under the amber glow, revealing the fragile line where prejudice and protocol collide. The general waited, every bit the seasoned leader, while the officer wrestled with the uncertainty he had created and the truth his own eyes could no longer deny. Without warning, the young officer spun the general around, pinning him face first against the gleaming hood of the SUV. His grip was driven by a surge of overconfidence, a show of raw authority that left little room for respect. The cool metal of the patrol car's cuffs snapped shut around the general's wrists, pressing sharply into his skin until red lines bloomed across his forearms. Even a man trained to brace for explosions and gunfire felt the sting of that steel. The general closed his eyes for a measured 2 seconds, not out of fear, but as a quiet reminder to himself that he still held command of his reactions. He drew a deep breath, centering himself in the eye of this unexpected storm. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried the weight of every rank he had earned. "You've just made the greatest mistake of your career," he said, each word deliberate and calm. Behind him, the officer allowed a broad, smug grin to spread across his face. It was the grin of someone convinced that the badge on his uniform gave him carte blanche, that the man he'd just subdued would knuckle under without question. Arms braced on the hood, he chuckled. "And who's going to stop me?" The general didn't open his eyes again. His tone remained even, almost gentle in contrast to the raw tension. "One phone call," he replied. In that moment, the officer's self-satisfaction wavered. He tried to process what those words meant, but before he could, a pair of burly arms pulled him backward away from the general and into the open door of the waiting patrol car. Hands still cuffed, the general rose to his feet with slow dignity. He spared the officer a final nod. "Think on that," he said, voice unwavering. And then he was led away, the night air swallowing the echo of those words. The officer stood frozen, cuff in hand, as the weight of the general's calm declaration sank in. In the shadowed glow of the street lamp, it became clear that true authority needs no threats, only the unwavering certainty of the truth. Inside the station, the joke about another car thief in custody echoed through the tile-floored lobby. Laughter and casual banter bounced off the walls as the general was led past rows of cold coffee cups left on a long folding table, evidence of a morning shift that had already gone stale. He walked with measured dignity, the weight of those cuffs far lighter than the bias he'd felt moments before. A seasoned sergeant, one of those officers who knew every name on the force, paused mid-step when he saw the general's uniform stripes peeking out from under his civilian jacket. He straightened, clearing his throat. "Sir, are you General Langston?" His voice held genuine respect, slicing through the din of mocking voices. The room fell silent in an instant. The handcuffs clicked open in what felt like slow motion. Just 10 seconds of restraint, enough time for that single phone call to make the entire atmosphere shift. The sergeant guided the general into a small interview room off to the side, away from prying eyes, pulling a chair out to help him sit. His colleagues hovered in the doorway, curiosity mingled with unease. At the dispatch room's back wall, the young officer stood pale and rigid, clutching the papers that had once felt like proof of his authority. His earlier swagger had evaporated in the span of a ringing phone. One by one, the other officers drifted into the hallway, drawn by the crackle of voices over the open mic radio. Then came the unmistakable voice. "This is the Pentagon. Release General Robert Langston immediately." Everything froze. The mugs collecting dust on the refreshment table, the muscle memory of relaxed postures, even the overhead fan seemed to halt mid-rotation. The sergeant at the desk clicked his radio button and said, "Understood, sir. General Langston is released." Almost before anyone could react, the general stood, flexing his wrists free of the metal's red imprint. He offered a polite nod to the sergeant, gratitude woven into a simple gesture. The young officer, still clutching his cuffs, looked on with wide, unsettled eyes, no words left to defend his actions. In that moment, the station's heartbeat shifted from idle banter to respectful hush. The loudest lesson of all echoed through every corridor. True authority requires accountability, and even the smallest call can set justice back on course. The cell door swung open with a soft clang, and the general stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light. He paused just long enough to gently massage the bright red lines marking his wrists. He moved with the steady grace of someone who has faced far greater trials than a brief confinement. His gaze settled on the young officer who still stood stiffly against the wall, bound with his own handcuffs. "Earlier you asked, 'Who will stop me?'" The general said, voice calm but resolute. "Now I'll answer, just one phone call." His tone held no triumph, only the quiet certainty of a man secure in his authority and his rights. At that moment, the doors to the lobby burst open, and a convoy of sleek black SUVs rolled in, blocking out the daylight. At their head stood a high-ranking federal commissioner, face set in an expression so cold it seemed carved from steel. He strode forward without a word, relaying orders through clipped nods and the tap of a badge against the hood. Behind him, soldiers in tailored uniforms fanned out, creating an unspoken barrier that left no doubt where real power lay. The young officer shifted uncomfortably, wrists pulled taut behind his back, every muscle rigid. In a twist of irony, the very cuffs he had snapped onto the general were now being used as his own shackles. The commissioner approached the officer, took the metal loop in his hand, and clicked it closed around the officer's wrists once more, this time, a fitting lesson in accountability. No command was issued aloud, none was needed. The sight spoke volumes about the balance between authority and its limits. Onlooker station staff, curious visitors, even the sergeant who had intervened fell silent. The convoy's engines idled low, echoing the solemn hush. In that charged stillness, the unspoken lesson was clear. A badge does not grant immunity from the consequences of one's actions. Real authority demands respect for the law and for the rights of every individual, regardless of rank. As the federal team escorted the general away, head held high, the young officer remained pinned by his own choices. In that tableau of black vehicles and flashing lights, power and responsibility stood face to face, each defining the other, and neither to be taken lightly. A heavy hush settled over the precinct once the young officer was led away. The fluorescent lights hummed as if uncertain aloud, and the rows of empty desks loomed like witnesses to a drama that exposed every rank to its own reflection. Word raced through the building's corridors and over the airwaves. A high-ranking army general had been unlawfully detained. In that instant, everyone understood what otherwise remained unspoken, that no one stands above the law, not even those who wear stars on their collars or badges on their chests. Officers who had earlier exchanged smirks with their peer now lowered their gazes. The banal jokes about another car thief fell silent, replaced by a wary respect that hung in the air like a palpable presence. The clerk who kept track of paperwork paused mid-typing, the dispatcher's fingers stilled above the keyboard. Even the water cooler, once a gathering place for casual gossip, felt oddly muted, its ring of waiting cups suddenly conspicuous in the quiet. In the briefing room, the sergeant, who had intervened, closed the door behind him and took a long, steadying breath before addressing his team. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His measured tone carried the weight of authority shaped by integrity. "Let this be the last time," he said. "True power doesn't clamor for attention. It shines through conviction, through unwavering respect for the rules that bind us all." Down the hall, the young officer sat in an empty holding cell, head bowed, the cold metal of his own cuffs reminding him that a badge is never a shield against accountability. His earlier certainty had given way to an unsettling clarity. Respect is earned by restraint and humility, not asserted through force or fear. Outside, morning light began to filter through the barred windows, offering a promise of renewal. Justice had moved not with a roar, but with a thunderous inevitability, one that left no room for indifference. The powerful lesson echoed through every rank and file: authority must be tempered by honor, and the measure of leadership lies not in the volume of one's commands, but in the quiet strength of doing right. And in that solemn stillness, the precinct and every officer within it was reminded that the true authority of the law outlasts any moment of misplaced arrogance. A few months later, the precinct felt a different pulse. The young officer had been quietly reassigned, his desk empty and gathering dust. In the roll call room, the sergeant, now recently promoted, paused at his own nameplate, remembering how quickly respect can be lost. The badge on his chest no longer felt like mere metal, but a daily reminder of the promise he'd made, to uphold the law without prejudice. Outside, the community had shifted too. The street where the General Sub once glowed beneath oak trees now hosted regular coffee with a cop mornings. Neighbors young and old lined up, not with suspicion but with questions about policy, fairness, even personal stories of encounters gone wrong. Officers listened genuinely and answered with openness that turned once strained relations into cautious trust. At headquarters, internal training had changed. No longer was procedural compliance enough. Every recruit's first week now began with a workshop titled Empathy and Authority, led by a decorated veteran who'd witnessed both battlefield heroism and the raw sting of discrimination. Role plays replaced rote drills, recruits practiced de-escalation alongside marksmanship. The message was clear: true strength lies in restraint. In the general's office, once a site of sudden confrontation, a simple plaque had been mounted: "Justice is measured in respect, not force." He himself had returned to duty, mentoring young officers on leadership born of integrity, not intimidation. His calm presence reminded them that rank is a responsibility to protect rights, not a license to override them. Even the community recognized change. Local news ran stories about reduced complaints, and a grassroots group held quarterly forums on law and dignity. Their motto: accountability echoes louder than power. And so as seasons turned, the precinct and the neighborhood it served learned that moments of crisis can become catalysts for lasting reform. In the quiet that followed thunder, a new understanding had taken root: that authority is only as honorable as the respect it commands. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional. All characters and events are creations of the author and are not intended to reference or criticize any real person. It is designed to raise awareness of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating one another with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose all forms of violence, prejudice, and injustice. Please consider this before viewing.